All right, thank you so much. And thank you, I'll just echo what was said before. Thank you all to the organizers and everyone the army of people who put this festival together. I feel so honored to be here with you all with a rich community, and this really is, especially as a more formal Western scientist, we don't get festivals like this. We go to really dry science conferences, and to be a part of this community is really unique. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about some of my work dealing with narwhal acoustics and underwater sound. A lot of people ask me, how did I end up studying narwhals? And often I say I have always been fascinated by remote and wild places. Being in remote places like this pictured here always humbles me, makes me feel alive, and brings me into the present moment. And I imagine most or all of the people in this room share those experiences and places that bring them back to what's most important. And this is one of my favorite photos that I took in Antarctica when I worked there. And every time I look at it, it takes me back right to that place and how I felt when I was there. I was so inspired by these places that I spent several years working in Antarctica. And I was working at a small base called Palmer Station. It's the small of the 3 US bases in Antarctica. And for 2 summer seasons, for about 6 months, I was working aboard a small boat like this. This is just a time lapse showing some of our routine sampling each week, where we would take a CTD rosette, this big instrument, and put it off the back of the boat, collect water samples, and then take that back to the lab for analysis. And this program was part of a larger long-term ecological research program that studied everything from bacteria and phytoplankton, going all the way up to seabirds and whales. And we used a number of instruments, and really I was so fascinated by the cool technology that scientists have to study the ocean. And this continued in Alaska, where I spent the other half of the summer working on different fish projects. So I was in the Prince William Sound Science Center's project, studying pink salmon in Prince William Sound, as well as working on the Copper River, studying kings from fish wheels. And I say all of this because it is really through these experiences in Antarctica and Alaska that inspired my genuine curiosity for studying the organisms and animals that we find in some of the most remote places of the world. And so more recently in my career, I have shifted my attention northward to the Arctic. Our location in Sitka is marked in red there. And today I'm going to be focusing on a different part of the world, the Atlantic sector of the Arctic. And this is outlined here. It's kind of bridging the Canadian High Arctic and Greenland. And this part of the world is home to one of the most iconic, cryptic, and mystical creatures, the narwhal. I still meet people who don't know that narwhals actually exist. And I'm here to tell you that they do, in fact, exist. I have seen them. And yeah, today we're going to talk about a bit of the sounds that they produce, as well as sounds that we produce that impact them. So the English name narwhal is derived from an Old Norse word meaning corpse whale. And as the story goes, this is in reference to its skin color, which is like a mottled gray color, and it looks like a drowned sailor, or that's how the story goes. And the scientific name, Monodon monoceros, is derived from Greek meaning one tooth, one horn. So many people in the Middle Ages believed that narwhal tusks were actually unicorn horns. Now, narwhals were not the original inspiration for the unicorn myth, but they played a significant role in reinforcing and shaping the narwhal myth in European culture. For example, the narwhal tusk, shown in the bottom left here, was mounted to a unicorn head, and now it's kept in a Polish museum. But it's also been incorporated into a lot of royal objects. In this case, this is a throne in Denmark, where there are multiple tusks that were embedded into the throne, as well as a royal scepter in the bottom here. So the idea of unicorns came before Europeans were aware of narwhals. And because Europeans didn't know narwhals existed, traders like the Vikings could go hunt narwhals, bring the tusks back, and sell those tusks for large sums of money, especially for European rulers that could pay for those prized unicorn horns. But well before European exposure to narwhals, of course, for millennia, narwhals have been an important cultural species for communities in present-day Canada and Greenland. So these photos were taken from Scoresby Sound in East Greenland, one of the communities in East Greenland that still rely on narwhals for subsistence. And so they hunt narwhal for the meat, the skin, and blubber, much like the communities in Alaska here. Out of the 90 species of whales, dolphins, and porpoises that inhabit the world's oceans, only 3 cetacean species inhabit Arctic waters year-round, and that is the narwhal, beluga, and the bowhead whale. Now, the narwhal's closest relative is the beluga whale, and these 2 whale species are part of the monodontid family, and they are the only 2 Arctic toothed whale species. And then, of course, we have the baleen whale, bowhead whale, which is a much larger filter-feeding whale. But if you look at these 3 whales, you might notice that none of them have a dorsal fin. And this is because these Arctic whale species have evolved to inhabit ice-covered waters. And of course, if they had a big fin sticking out of their back, it would be really difficult to navigate those ice-covered waters. Now, interestingly, again, the beluga and narwhal are close relatives of one another. If you look inside of a beluga mouth, you will find teeth. But if you look inside a narwhal mouth, you will find no teeth. It's like a gummy grandma. And so the only tooth that narwhals have is this tusk. So it's not a horn, it's an elongated tooth that protrudes out of the upper left jaw, and of only males. So actually the female narwhal doesn't have a tusk. There's a very small percentage that might have a tusk. But it's only the males that have this elongated tooth. And so many people wonder what the function is of the narwhal tusk. And I am also here to tell you that they do not use it to spear through the ice. They don't use it to fight one another. And they don't use it to spear or stun fish. So they don't use it to hunt. What we know is that the narwhal tusk is a sexually selected trait, which is much like a stag with large horns or a peacock, a male peacock that has colorful feathers and is trying to attract a mate. And we know this because if the tusk was important for survival, we would also see females having that, right? But the females are doing just fine. So it is a sexually selected trait. I mentioned narwhals are only found in the Atlantic sector of the Arctic. So this map is looking at the Arctic from the top down. So the North Pole is in the center of this map. And here I'm showing the range of both belugas and narwhals. So belugas, their distribution is shown in blue, so they cover almost the entire Arctic. Whereas narwhals are shown in orange, so they have a much more restricted range within the Canadian High Arctic, Greenland, and then extending into Russia. Across the globe, there are estimated to be about 80,000 narwhals across 12 different subpopulations. And among those subpopulations, 80% of the world's narwhals are found west of Greenland, in this Canadian High Arctic and this water called Baffin Bay in between Canada and Greenland. And it is these populations that we know the most about. And across all of the narwhal populations, we know that narwhal movements are very closely linked to the sea ice cycle. So we've been hearing about other species closely linked to sea ice, like bowhead whales. And so, like many whales, each season, narwhals are making large migrations over vast distances. But for narwhals, again, they're closely linked to the sea ice cycle so that when sea ice advances in the fall, they move south, and then in the spring, they move back north. But for the East Greenland populations, they also follow the sea ice, but we aren't really sure exactly what those routes look like. So especially north of Russia, this is where we know very little about narwhals and many other whale species. So in the summer, when these narwhals are moving northward, they are occupying fjords, bays, and inlets, and they go really, really close to glacier fronts, like right up to the front of them. And then in winter, as these whales are migrating back south, along with the sea ice edge, they're found really far offshore in extremely dense pack ice in less than 3% open water. So when scientists are looking for them, they have to follow these cracks in the ice or leads, and you can find small narwhal pods in many, many miles of just covered sea ice. But to truly appreciate the seasonality of the sea ice cycle, I'm going to zoom out to the entire Arctic again. And I'll have you focus on this red box here, where these arrows are indicating the southward movements and northward movements of whales corresponding to sea ice advance and retreat. So on the left, I'm showing the sea ice maximum that occurs in March of each year. And then again, as temperatures warm, sea ice retreats, and it reaches a minimum in September of each year. And the difference in sea ice cover between the March maximum and the September minimum is equivalent to the area of the contiguous United States. So it represents a huge transformation in the Arctic each year. And as we know, and we're hearing about a lot this weekend, major ecosystem shifts are underway in the Arctic from climate change. So the Arctic has been experiencing some of the most profound changes with warming at rates 3 to 4 times the global mean. And we've observed an approximately 50% reduction in sea ice cover since satellite records began in 1979. So you can see this for yourself here. On the left, I've pictured the sea ice cover from September 1979, and on the right is the sea ice cover from September of this year. And based on the linear trend from 1979 to present day, September has lost over 600,000 square miles of sea ice cover, which is roughly equivalent to the area of the state of Alaska. And an increasing number of open water days or ice-free days each year is allowing people to access the Arctic more than ever before. And potentially, one of the most consequential is the expected increase of vessels moving through the Arctic each year. So these red lines are indicating the 2 main sea routes, the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route. And you can see the open water region is now very easily exposed for the transit of commercial ships, tourism, etc. And what comes with this is an increase in underwater noise. So there are many sounds produced in the global oceans, and they're either naturally occurring or generated by humans. And the primary anthropogenic sound sources include marine vessel propulsion, so boats, active sonar, and marine construction and development. So boats can be all kinds of forms, right? We have commercial shipping, so big tankers going through, recreational or tourism, fishing, research, or military operations. And all of these vessels have sonar. They have echo sounders for navigation to make sure they don't run aground. But also in research, we might be mapping the sea floor, or have active acoustics that can map prey fields, for example. And then in terms of development, particularly for the Arctic, there's a lot of interest for oil and gas exploration. Much less so, but it might be more and more in the future is offshore wind. This is particularly important, though, in the lower 48, especially for North Atlantic right whales. As we are trying to build renewable resources, it also comes at a cost. And then finally, pile driving for marine platforms, and I'll show an example of this later in my talk, but this is the building of these platforms that might be used for oil and gas exploration or just development of the coastlines in the Arctic. And we know that at significant levels or intensities, these sounds can cause hearing loss to marine mammals, and that can be temporary or permanent. It can cause auditory masking, so this is when a sound is loud enough to essentially drown out the sound of the whales, so they can't hear one another. It can also cause physiological stress and or avoidance behavior, so the whales are trying to get away from that disturbing sound. And now I want to bring your attention to one particular activity, and these are seismic air guns. So seismic air guns are something that we're hearing in our underwater recordings in the Arctic, and this is when a ship is towing what's called a seismic air gun, and this device blasts out compressed air, and it creates a really big sound that then is reflected off the seafloor, and it's used to identify oil and gas deposits under the seabed. And then a series of towed hydrophones behind the boat is able to record the reflected sound, and that's how people can identify where those deposits are located. So while effective at what it's doing to identify these deposits, these sounds are so loud and they can propagate over thousands of kilometers. So just to put this in perspective, if there was an air gun blast in Utqiagvik or Barrow, a whale could hear it here if it was just open ocean. So really, really vast distances. So this is an example of an air gun. This is not from the Arctic, but it is from a known blue whale foraging area off of New Zealand. And the image here is called a spectrogram. We're going to be seeing a couple more of these in my talk. On the x-axis, we have time. So you'll see these sequential blasts with the color, which is the intensity of the sound. And on the y-axis is the frequency. So this is like the pitch of the sound. So we'll have a listen. So it's even shaking the whole building. I don't know if that's related, but you might notice here this pink box, which is outlining blue whale calls. And so this is a prime example of that auditory masking. So these really loud sounds produced from the air gun are overlapping in the frequency range, and they're more intense than the sounds produced by the whales. And so obviously this is a concern for really important behaviors or times where whales are needing to communicate with one another. And these airgun blasts, they're happening about every 8 seconds. This can go on continuously for many, many months. So it's a real issue, and particularly in the Arctic, where especially in Greenland, we've heard these airgun pulses very, very far away from where our hydrophones were and where that sound was being produced. So aside from human noise pollution, the ocean has a rich soundscape of natural sound sources as well. And natural sound sources in the Arctic are different than those found in mid-latitudes that are more characterized by coral reefs, snapping shrimp, fish species. So here, it's more dominated by marine mammals, whales, seals, walruses, and some fish and invertebrates. And then there's a lot of abiotic sounds as well, so wind, rain, storm events, waves or currents, and then ice in all of its forms. So we have sea ice crackling, breaking apart, forming, icebergs and glaciers calving. And so the Arctic is home to some of the most quiet and loudest soundscapes in the world. And so here I'm going to show you an example. If you were to go right up to the front of a marine terminating glacier, it would sound something like this. So it's been puzzling for us acousticians studying narwhals, because we're like, why did they want to go to these really noisy places? And we have some hypotheses about potentially why, but it is extremely loud. In contrast, the winter can be extremely quiet. So as these areas are covered in landfast ice, that ice insulates the ocean surface from the atmosphere that's causing a lot of that ocean noise. And so it's extremely quiet. And now we think about the Arctic becoming more ice-free. We're not sure exactly what the fate of underwater noise levels is going to be like. And there are a lot of efforts to just establish baseline underwater noise levels in order for us to know how that's going to be changing in the future. But we expect or hypothesize that it will just get louder. And that's from a couple of different sources. One, again, if it's open water, it's exposed to the atmosphere, so storm events, rain, wind, that's all going to create more noise. And then we're also seeing more subpolar whale species migrating farther north and staying in Arctic waters longer during the summer. So all of those subpolar whale species also are vocalizing, making noise, so that's contributing to increased noise levels. And then, of course, finally, human activities, which I already talked about. So increase of vessel traffic and all of that development is going to be also producing more underwater noise. So I hope at this point you're starting to realize that we can learn a lot from sound. And even as humans, we rely on sound to interpret a lot about our surroundings and to connect with one another. By listening, we can understand what the environment we're like is in, or what the environment we're in is like. Are we in a noisy bar, or are we on a hike and we're just listening to the birds or the wind in the trees? We can also figure out who is there. We all know the sounds of our loved ones and what their voices sound like, or maybe our dogs. And by listening, we can identify the number of individuals as well. Is it one person talking? Is it a group of people talking? We can also understand the location and the direction of that sound. So for example, when we have people in the audience speaking from the mic, we can't always know where they are because we can't see where or hear where that sound is coming from. Similarly, we can know when a plane is over our head, when a boat is approaching us. So we're really good ourselves at our version of echolocation. And finally, we can learn a lot about people's behavior. So we can understand activities, like we can hear someone walking up and down the stairs or playing basketball. And we can also discern emotion from people's voices. So we know what a whining child sounds like, or a whining adult sounds like. So we can learn a lot about someone's emotional state just from how they sound. And so even more than for humans, sound is extremely important for marine mammals. Sound travels 4 times faster in water than it does in air. So similar to visible light in the atmosphere, sound travels very efficiently in water. And so marine mammals, as a result, have evolved to use sound for critical functions, including communication with one another, mating displays, staying within their groups as cultural animals that they are, navigation, and for hunting. And particularly for the narwhal and for toothed whales like the beluga as well, they use echolocation for identifying their prey fields. And for the narwhal, that is one of the deepest diving whales in the world. It's going to these depths greater than a mile deep, and light is not penetrating that far down. So these animals are relying on echolocation to sense their environment and to hunt for food. And the narwhal, particularly in this West Greenland population, is diving to these depths over a mile deep and hunting on Greenland halibut, squid, these benthic species. And actually in the summers, when hunters have opened up the stomachs of narwhals, they've been often empty. And so we also know it's these winter feeding periods where they're diving to these really great depths that they're acquiring most of their energy sources. So on the right here, I have an example of echolocation. Again, these are two spectrograms, so same plot that we saw before with the air guns, with time on the x-axis and the frequency or pitch on the y-axis. And here, similarly, you can see these pulses in the spectrogram, and those are individual echolocation clicks. So I'm going to play the upper clip here so you can hear an example of echolocation from a narwhal. So to me, it kind of sounds like a pileated woodpecker or an old typewriter or something, but you can get a sense that it's like this probing of their environment. And we know that when we actually use it in recordings to identify when a whale is really close to prey capture. So if it's swimming up, it finds a fish, it will click really quickly in quick succession. So we call them buzzes. It sort of sounds like this really quick zzz before they capture the fish. So you're hearing a little bit of that in this recording as well. But another thing I want to highlight here is that our human ears are only capturing a small fraction of the sound that these whales are using. So our human hearing is only able to capture 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, which is this orange box here. And these whales are producing echolocation above 200 kilohertz. So when we're listening to recordings as acousticians, we're also relying on just quantifying the sounds above our human hearing range, because these whales, again, have evolved to use sound and thus have a different hearing range compared to humans. As highly social animals, narwhals produce a wide variety of sounds. So I just showed you echolocation, but here I'm going to show you two examples of some of the other sounds that they produce. It's like out of Star Wars or something. It's crazy. So if you imagine, like, you're given a recording of that, and it's from some region west of Greenland, and you're told to figure out what species this is. It might be hard unless you know for sure, oh, this is what Bob sounds like, this is what Jill sounds like. And similarly, like, we acousticians have to have labels and identifiers for knowing what each whale species sounds like. But when they produce these wild sounds of different forms, it can be really difficult to identify them in recordings if you haven't had any visual confirmation of what species was there. And so one issue is beluga whales and narwhals that reside in the same Arctic waters at the same time, it can be difficult to identify them when they're co-occurring. And so I'm going to play an example of beluga whales as well, just so you can appreciate some of the diversity of the sounds that they produce. All right, so maybe you noticed there are more whistles in this recording, and that can be one identifier that belugas are present because they produce these really variable whistles. But still, if we don't have like a whole repertoire of what these animals are producing, it can be really hard to identify if one species is present, or even maybe they're both present. So a lot of my research was finding a way to differentiate their echolocation clicks, and it has proven to be easier and with more confidence that we can identify the two species using their echolocation clicks, where belugas are producing much higher pitch echolocation than narwhals do. And as scientists, to collect these recordings, we can use a whole suite of different instruments and sensors to do this. And overall, this method is called passive acoustic monitoring, where we're essentially eavesdropping on the animals that are in the water. So we can use animal-borne tags, so tags that are fixed to the whale itself. Gliders, which is shown in the middle there, which are like underwater robots that are gliding through the ocean. Or seafloor anchored ocean moorings. So they have an anchor connected to the seafloor and an array of instruments that are suspended in the water column. And it's a really useful approach to use passive acoustics because it is typically a non-invasive method, unless it's an animal-borne tag. And we can get really long-term recordings. So we can have a hydrophone recording for years at a time, and we can get the seasonal presence and absence of whales in that area. And so now coming back to narwhals, I'm going to talk about some data that were collected from northwest Greenland in the red box here. And these data were collected off of this boat here, the research vessel Zahn. And all of the instruments were deployed and recovered off the back of the ship. And what I'm going to show here is the deployment of an ocean mooring. So here is a line connected to this instrument, and this is one of the hydrophones. It's called an oral. And in this package, it has a battery, a memory storage system, and then the hydrophone itself. And so the people on the back deck are slowly paying out all of these floats that keep that instrument suspended in the water column vertically. And then there's also instruments that are recording ocean properties, so temperature, salinity, those kinds of things. And so you can see just like a necklace, it's beaded out with a number of floats, instruments in between, and then at the end, there's a big anchor. And that's what you can see in this image here. And once that anchor is released, it then pulls down all of the instruments that were carried out, and then those floats are vertically suspended in the water column. And then a year goes by, and people come back to recover that mooring, and mooring recoveries can look like a lot of different things depending on the place, location, conditions. In this situation, these moorings were recovered from a small boat. And so the scientists can communicate with a release mechanism that's just above the anchor. And through acoustics, they can tell that release mechanism to open, and then all of the floats pull it to the surface. And then ideally, you can see the floats, and then you can recover those instruments and get your data back. So on the left here is just a schematic of what these ocean moorings looked like. So there's a big float on top, and then not pictured in the schematic is a number of other floats in between. But we have two CTD instruments, conductivity temperature depth recorders, so they measure temperature and salinity. And then some temperature loggers, just measuring temperature. And then finally, two hydrophones that are recording the presence of belugas and narwhals in this area. And so 6 of these moorings were deployed over 2 years at multiple locations that were right in front of glaciers in that northwest Greenland area. And if you remember, in the summer, narwhals are returning to these glacial fjords every summer. But we don't completely know why these habitats are really important for these animals, and so that was the main impetus for this research. And we also wanted to know, are there specific features of specific glaciers or sites that might draw or attract narwhals to one over the other? And what we found is that there was no preference for a specific site or glacier, so narwhals were moving in between these glacial fjord systems. And this is consistent with local hunters that also remarked that narwhals are always moving between these sites throughout the summer. And we also learned that narwhals are occupying these areas right after the peak meltwater runoff from the summer, when the ocean's becoming cool and fresh. So during the summer, the Greenland ice sheet melts, and it drains a huge amount of fresh water at the margins or the coastline of Greenland. And then with that, we have sea ice melt, we have glaciers calving, icebergs melting, so there's this huge influx of fresh water that makes the ocean cold and fresh during the summer. And we saw the presence of whales right after that peak meltwater runoff from the summer. And based on previous literature also showing a correlation between narwhal abundance and cold temperatures, we're now hypothesizing that there might be some preference or even tolerance for narwhals to be in colder water habitats. We also found a delayed southward migration of narwhals by 1 month during the summer of 2019 after a major heat wave occurred that summer. And so we're seeing that narwhals are changing their migration timing in response to changing sea ice conditions, which again we're seeing with many other whale species in the Arctic. And so I also mentioned that we can learn a lot from tagged whales, and while I wasn't part of this research, I'm going to share a little bit about this as well. So over multiple years, scientists were collaborating with Inuit hunters in East Greenland, and these hunters would collect or catch narwhals in nets during their subsistence hunting, but then also work with scientists to tag some of those whales and then release them. And then those tags would fall off after a couple of months, and the scientists would recover those tags for the data. And so a big result that we learned from these studies is that narwhals show an atypical stress response. And so this image is just showing the tag on the whale and the routes that these whales were taking. There were 6 whales that were tagged in this study. And what we saw is after net entanglement, which is a stressful experience for these whales, their heartbeats lowered to less than 4 beats per minute, which for reference, similar to humans, a normal range is 60 to 100 beats per minute. And at the same time, these whales swam down and away as fast as possible. And this is greater than 25 strokes per minute, their tail stroking, for more than 10 consecutive minutes. And so what this means is we're seeing extreme bradycardia, or lowered heart rate, which is a normal response for deep diving marine mammals. But it's related to also a flight response where they're swimming as fast as possible. And so there's these paradoxical behaviors that leads to a rapid depletion of their oxygen stores. And so it's physiologically really stressful, and it's something that we're also seeing in response to human-generated noise. And so building on the study that I was just talking about, the same team put acoustic tags on these whales so they could hear the vocalizations of the whales and not just get their movement and heart rate data. And they looked at narwhal heart rate, movement, and vocalizations in response to being in the presence of vessel noise and airgun sounds. And what they found is that they saw, again, this atypical stress response with a suppressed heart rate and increased activity or swimming behavior. But also whales completely stopped vocalizing when they were really close, within 6 to 7 kilometers of the sound. And interestingly, and to our surprise, they were equally responsive to vessel noise and vessel noise with airgun pulses. So we would have expected maybe that the airgun pulses that are a lot louder might induce a more stressful response from the whales. But in this case, they were equally responsive to just vessel noise and airgun pulses. So it's the novelty of the sound and not the intensity of the sound itself that is stressful for these whales. And so one silver lining in all of this is that we humans have a lot of control over mitigating underwater noise that is generated by us. We can turn it off or we can turn it down. We're already seeing this, especially in Washington State, to impose regulations on vessel speed. So the main source of the sound from boats is the engine, the propeller itself. So higher RPMs mean more noise. So we can bring the vessel speed down and decrease those noise levels. We can also prohibit noise-generating activities in critical marine habitats. And this is related to managing locations, routes, and timing that might be able to, again, mitigate those adverse effects of noise during these important times and places for marine mammals. There's also a lot of new technologies that are coming to light as we're trying to mitigate anthropogenic noise. And one in particular that you might have heard about is using a bubble curtain. So I have an example here of pile driving. So again, this is used to construct these marine platforms. I have an example in the upper right here for a wind farm that's being developed. And so it's this big platform. They're using the pile driving to create that platform. And they have 2 bubble net curtains around that platform, which is just as it sounds, it's a big net of bubbles. And what that does is it attenuates the sound that's being generated from that pile driving device. So I'm going to show, or you'll listen to an example of pile driving. And what's cool about this audio clip is that you can hear the sound before and after the bubble curtain is activated. So we'll see if you can hear that. So you can tell it's still there for sure, but it's less. So it does help. So I covered a lot today. I'm just going to leave you with a couple of nuggets that hopefully as you're talking to your friends about what you learned about narwhals, you can remember these 3 points. First, narwhals are changing their migration timing in response to changing sea ice conditions. They're highly ice-associated species, and so we're seeing that, of course, as sea ice is changing, they're also changing alongside it. Second, that human-generated noise poses a significant threat to these animals, and passive acoustics allows us to study the impacts of sea ice loss and underwater noise pollution to these animals. So thank you all so much for listening, and I can take some questions.
Thank you for that. How do narwhals make all those noises? What's the mechanism that they use anatomically to make the clicks and whistles and all that?
Yeah, they have the same like vocal cord structure as humans do. The echolocation is a little bit different. And like maybe you've heard about the melon that like belugas have, and they can kind of move and contort it. It's a big fatty structure that they have in their forehead. So the sound is emitted through that melon, and then actually the sound is absorbed back through their lower jaw, and then their brain is processing that to sense their environment. But yeah, the like sounds they're producing is much the same as humans are producing sounds.
So, single tooth that has the ability to become a tusk?
Do females have a tusk as well? Or do they have a tooth that could form? So there are some rare cases, I think it's like less than 1% that people have observed females with a tusk. And in some cases, even males can have 2 tusks. There's like 2 teeth coming out, because the normal one that's protruding is the left tooth in the upper jaw. So yes, it's possible that females can have a tusk, but it's extremely rare. And they don't, like it's just not there in most cases.
I noticed that one of the sound recordings that you used were of Cook Inlet beluga whales. There isn't much of an overlap there where there are narwhals. Where there are narwhals and belugas together, do you notice that they mimic each other's sounds?
That's a great question. We don't have enough observations to really answer that, but it's a really good question. From just observing their movements, they tend to specialize in different locations. So again, narwhals are kind of in these fjords in the summer, and then they go offshore into really dense pack ice in the winter. And belugas tend to be in more coastal sea ice, like marginal ice zone areas. So they're not in the winter going to these really dense ice areas. And their summering grounds are different, so they're not found in the same fjords and estuaries. So in that sense, they do kind of occupy different areas. But when they are together, and there's been like narwhal sightings in beluga pods, it's possible that they could be mimicking one another. They definitely occupy the same like frequency ranges and produce very similar sounds.
So, is it true that they use their horns to break through the ice and then they go along the surface and then break back through to go back into the water?
It is not true. So yeah, the big horn is called a tusk, and if you think about your tooth, it's actually pretty sensitive. So if like someone took a hammer to your tooth, it would be pretty painful. So narwhals are not using this big tooth as like a tool in that way to like, because going through ice is really strong. Like bowhead whales have, their heads are massive to be able to break through really big ice. So no, narwhals aren't using their tusks to break through ice.
We have to wrap things up. One more question.
Yes, I read something about the tusk having some ability to hear, to emit sound to the narwhal, or some kind of, in other words, there was some research on them feeling something through their tusk. I wanted to see if you had heard anything about that. And the other one was I read an account where when someone was talking about narwhals and belugas being together, that there were these orcas. This was an Inuit native account of these orcas that were pressing and surrounding them and so that they could not get out and move around. They were and they had a narwhal that speared into an orca. And I don't know if you've heard anything about that, but that was an Inuit story that they reported happened.
Yeah, I haven't heard of the spearing of a orca with the tusk, but I also could imagine in a stressful situation like that, I mean, the tusk is straight in front of their head, and so if there is some level of defense, then I don't know if the narwhal would actually be using it to spear the whale as much as just trying to defend itself with its body. But yeah, killer whale predation is an increasing concern for narwhals, and that's being observed more and more. And in many acoustic recordings, we are hearing orcas staying farther north longer in the summers because there's no ice. They don't have limits of navigating those waters. So yes, with narwhals, they're being preyed upon more and more by orcas. Your second question, I'm forgetting. Emitting sound from the tusk. No, I can go back to the literature and see what I can find, but I don't know of any concrete evidence that that's like a propagation mechanism for the sound. It's from the melon. Yeah, and receiving the sound is through their lower jaw. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your expertise on narwhals, and